Sorry, I was muted. All right, every possible tech failure has we're in for a smooth ride from here on. Very quick overview of Rwanda, just to get you situated for this case study. Colonial history was quite complicated. It included time spent being colonized by Germany and by Belgium. If you've heard anything about Rwanda, it's probably the genocide that occurred in 1994. And so what I'm going to talk about has all occurred in the aftermath of that genocide. And in that sense, Rwanda is and feels very much like a brand new country. Since 1994, it was really reborn. They have about 13 million people there. This thing just doesn't work. President Paul Kagame has been president since the country reunified, and after the genocide, he just took on a third term in office. And so all of the policy layers that I'm about to describe are credit to Paul Kagame or blame to Paul Kagame, depending on how you feel about them. Let me give you a little sense of the state of the economy and the status of poverty in Rwanda, because the example I'm about to show you about managed retreat takes place within that setting. So Rwanda has one of the lowest GDPs. It's ranked 141st out of all countries. So it's considered a very poor country. However, it is the fastest growing country on the continent, and in fact, one of the fastest growing in the world. Economic growth has been between 7 and 10% year after year after year. And this is average at 7.5%, one of the fastest growing countries. But still, more than a third of the population in Rwanda is below the poverty line. And it's really important to understand the nature of poverty in Rwanda is concentrated in rural areas. 80% of the population are smallholder farmers, and 93% of those poor people live in rural areas and smallholder. So the case of Rwanda is in this setting that I talk about it. Development efforts in Rwanda, and Paul Kagame, when he talks about how Rwanda is developing, his aspiration is to move Rwanda from the subsistence economy that it is currently in toward what he calls a knowledge economy. And this is really quite explicit and outward facing and is baked into all of the development and economic policies of the country. So before I can tell the story of Rweru, Model Green Village, as an example of resettlement in Rwanda, I have to give a very little bit, and I'm trying to do this quickly, background on resettlement policy in the country so it can make some sense. Starting in 1996, this is right after people begin returning to Rwanda after the genocide, where most of the country fled, the stayed in refugee camps outside the borders, came back in and began finding plots of land anywhere they could and putting down stakes and building homes and setting up crops. And the new government immediately established what's called the Human Settlement Policy that intended to move all of these disparate homes across the countryside into these grouped villages. They're called imidugudu, and it's intended to create a village structure for lots of reasons. The argument is this way the government can provide education, healthcare, roads, and other sorts of supports if everybody is consolidated. Everybody lives at the end of a different dirt road. It's much harder to have services reach people. There's also a number of arguments that are made by the Rwandan government about promoting social cohesion, building democracy, and building leadership skills through these voodoo structures. And the understanding is if you move people out of their remote dwellings, you also free up that land for better ecosystem protection. So this was quickly followed by a few other policies that I need to talk about. Again, I know I'm rushing through this part, but I want to study. Two additional policies in Rwanda are worth mentioning for my case. One is called the Ubudehe program, and that categorizes all households according to wealth. Today, there are 5 categories. That number has changed a little bit over time, but each category is defined by how much land they own, how many cows people own, and how much wealth they hold. And it is a that has been so successful in allowing the government of Rwanda to channel supports where they are most needed that it has won a number of awards at the international level, the Ubudehe program. The Girinka program is worth mentioning because here's a little foreshadowing, you're about to see it in action. The Girinka program targets the lowest poverty level in the Ubudehe categories, and all of the families in that households in that lowest poverty category get a cow. This is the Girinka program. It's tremendously popular. Having a cow is a really important piece of social standing wealth in Rwanda. So the goal for the country now, this is sort of all background, the Ubudehe and the Girinka programs, the Imidugudu housing, this is all long-standing policy in Rwanda that has to do with poverty, resettlement, and economic growth. The government has stated its plan now to have 100% of residents in these remote rural areas into grouped model housing villages. And they have now added, and this is where I think this gets relevant for this conference and for my talk, the goal is now not just to move people out of remote settings for the sake of the arguments that I already explained, but also because they are now considered to be living in what are called high-risk zones. The overwhelming majority of these high-risk zones are considered high risk because of impacts from climate change. Most notably, floods, droughts, and landslides are really common in Rwanda. It's very hilly territory, and so landslides and flooding are quite dangerous for households that are out in the distance. There are now a number of these model, and some of them are called model green villages, and I'll show you why. And today they're at about 2/3 of rural residents live in these grouped housing developments. So as it's 67.5% on the way toward 100%. Remember, this is a tiny country with an authoritarian government, so the goal of 100% is quite realistic. This is possible. So now I'm going to tell the case of Rweru. This was a case that involved mandatory resettlement, and I'm showing you on the map. Here's a map of Rwanda. There's Lake Rweru, or the village of Rweru is right there. It's right on the southern border with Burundi. And there are two islands in and nearby this lake called Sharita Island and Mazane Island. Families had lived on those islands for generations, quite remote, quite isolated, and the government issued a mandate that all households from those two islands have to move to the mainland and settle in government-built village called Rweru Model Green Village. They did this in 4 phases, beginning in 2016, and they moved dozens of households at a time. My fieldwork was conducted just about a year ago exactly. I was there at this time of year. 1,777 individuals amounting to just under 300 households had been relocated at that point, and the process was still ongoing. There was another phase yet to come. Mazane Island is now off limits. It has been taken over by the military and is being used for military use. It's right again on the border with Burundi, so it's a strategic location. There were still hundreds of households on Sharita Island, and some of the people who had been moved had ongoing access back to their croplands in Sharita Island. What was I trying to do with this research? I was trying to understand this policy, the mandatory model village policy, as a form of resettlement, and try to understand whether or not this reflects good climate adaptation. Is this a form of adaptation? Is this the country adapting to having portions of its landscape now at high risk? And does it work? What are the barriers to having it succeed? And then we wanted to think about how this case and the details of this case at the micro scale, because we were speaking to individual people, helps us understand the larger concept of managed retreat. Dr. Ajibade, who helped me with the theoretical analysis of this case, we started thinking about livelihood transformations that occurred through this resettlement, and some that were positive and some that were negative. I worked deeply with University of Rwanda students. I spent a lot of time in Rwanda as a Fulbright scholar, and so I'm affiliated with the University of Rwanda there, and so I'm able to work with students. So my students at the University of Rwanda did all the interviews because they speak Kinyarwanda and I do not, but we recorded them. And so working with students and giving them an opportunity to participate in a research project is also part of the goals of the project. So, at the same time as I think about this kind of work, maybe builds adaptive capacity over the long term and in the large sense, I'm also interested in making sure that the process of doing the research also contributes. And so I hire only Rwandan students who work locally there. And then this project was really a pilot. It was very small scale, and I have now submitted a proposal to expand this project to study many other villages in Rwanda. So how did we do it? We traveled to the Rweru Model Green Village and we interviewed households. We used convenience sampling and quota sampling so we could talk to households in each of the phases of development. We conducted 38 semi-structured interviews with these households. Some of these interviews were 45 minutes or an hour long, so we had quite long transcripts. We did 20 additional shorter interviews, and I can talk about why we did it this way in the question and answer if you're curious. We translated all these transcripts and coded them through it using in vivo software. We also structurally made observations, took photographs, etc., but none of the people. This was quite confidential. Critiquing government policy is not safe in Rwanda, and so we went to great lengths to make sure that our respondents were safe and protected. I mostly met with dozens of NGOs and government leaders to understand the mechanisms of this policy. So what did we learn? Here's a photo of Rweru Model Green Village. I actually love this photo. I took it. I love it because it's a little misleading. It looks almost like I always think when I see this, it looks like these houses with green lawns. But in fact, what you can see is it's dirt roads, and this photo gives us a sense of, I think, the idealized vision model villages. And certainly this is an actual photo I took, so there's some truth to that idealism. What we found was that the average household size in this village was just over 5. 30% of those households were female-led. These numbers line up pretty well with national numbers. So what we conclude from this is the village is fairly representational. It's in line with the rest of the country. Every adult we spoke with was illiterate, and that's a function of having lived their lives on a remote island without schooling. The reason we know they are illiterate is they were given an option when we asked consent for the interview. They could sign their name or they could use a thumbprint. Everybody opted for the thumbprint. So we don't have rock solid proof that they're all illiterate, but we took it as a proxy, and it lines up with what we know about their backgrounds. But many of their kids are now attending schools, and this is an exciting chapter in their new life in the new village. 4 out of 5 kids of school age were, which is good news, but I always wonder, well, where's everybody else? And we'll talk a little bit about that. About a quarter of the respondents we spoke to had off-farm employment, which is absolutely groundbreaking for many households who moved from very remote areas. But at the time we were there, it was really in the middle of the pandemic, and a lot of that off-farm work had dried up and transportation corridors were closed, et cetera. I know I'm getting close. Okay, a couple more minutes. I'll go through it quickly. 3 more minutes. I'm going quickly. This is what life was like on the islands before people moved. Fishing was the main form of nutrition and livelihood development. They had very productive plots and they grew quite a lot of crops, but they had very few services. They were cut off and isolated. I have a few quotes here that I'll put in italics that were things we heard from our respondents. There was a primary school available, but everything was quite distant and healthcare was particularly challenging. Everybody talked to us about these perilous journeys they had taken by boat across these hippo-infested waters. Then we asked them, well, why did you relocate? Now, we knew the answer. The answer is the government mandated policy, but we wanted to hear what they thought. Everybody said, well, yes, finally, we've been asking for this for a long time. We've been asking our village leaders for relocation. Now it has finally come true. Many of them said they wanted to escape what they called high-risk zone, and I put this in quotes. We thought it was interesting. It's a reflection of government language making its way into the mouths of our respondents. And many of them credit President Kagame directly. He is the one who gave the order. He is the one who did this for us, and they really all celebrated that. We asked them what it was like to relocate. They said they took a boat from the island to the shore, and then they got in a car. For many of them, that was the first time they'd been in a car. They left most of their belongings behind. They were told their new homes would be fully furnished. And this is quite a long quote, but they organized and scheduled a day for us. We presented our challenges. There they began to raise awareness, telling us about the new good houses, happy and prepared. So this quote, I think, really captures the enthusiasm and optimism of many spoke with, and they talked about the advantages of being there. I feel like I'm really rushing now. I'm sorry, I only have a couple minutes. This is the healthcare center right as you drive into the new village, new and shining. This is a secondary school that was still being built when we were there. And this is the site of a vocational shed where people were learning to build and construct things. We asked them, what do you like about living in Rweru? They said, we can get to healthcare and schools, we can access clean water, we have these new houses with electricity, and we can go visit our relatives. A lot of people said we could go to church. So being able to have transport and mobility was really important after living in a really remote setting. Everybody got a cow. Remember the Garinka program? So all of these forest category in the Ubudehe program. Each household was given a cow, and they're individually owned but collectively managed in these cooperative cow sheds. And people we talked to said the advantages of moving to Rweru have been particularly strong for the poorest among us. Even within this extremely poor category, there are gradations, of course, of wealth and opportunity. Many people had this type of off-farm employment, these little, I call this the Rwandan bodega. They're these little tiny shops that people put up in front of their houses inside their kitchen, and they're able to get enough money or access credit to buy products and then sell them locally this way. But they had a lot of new challenges also, having moved to this new and very different way of life. The number one challenge we heard from people is our crops don't grow here. It's too hot. The climate, the microclimate was vastly different, even though the distance that they had moved was quite short. They moved from an island surrounded by a body of water to an inland drought-stricken area. And so they were experiencing difficulty growing crops for the first time. And we heard many people say, we're hungry for the first time. We've never been hungry. We always had fish, right? They don't have fish anymore. Finishing. And this is part of the answer is why aren't all the kids? One of our respondents explained it this way: when we don't have dinner, he doesn't go to school. And a lot of them said, yeah, great, we have cows now, but we don't know how to take care of cows. We've never had cows before. We're fishing people. And so people really struggled with that. They talked about having scarce access to drinking water. You can see people lining up with their jerry cans. Here's the water jug. So we saw this and it matched what we heard them saying. So that's why I include this photo. No other farm animals were allowed, and people had concerns about that, wanting pigs, chickens, and particularly goats are really common for rural households in Rwanda. There was a lot of concern among the phases. Some phases had been moved with better attributes than others. Some households got curtains on their windows and some didn't. And these were seen as real points of unfairness. So we saw some new sort of social sorting in the movement. They had been promised titles to their new properties that would then give them access to credit, right? But those titles, when we were there, had not yet arrived. So they didn't have land titles yet. People felt really frustrated that they had been misled. Okay, last slide. This is a mountain gorilla. They don't live anywhere near this different part of the country. I had to put it for a gorilla up here because look how cute that is. So what we conclude from this case that I just rushed through, resettlement is transformational. It's transformative, but it's both positive and negative elements to that transformation, and those need to be included. These resettlement programs, I think, are a really good example of mainstreaming climate change adaptation policy. It's now sort of baked into the resettlement policy, which has been around since 1996. So Rwanda has successfully integrated climate change adaptation in the form of relocation and resettlement as part of its national economic development strategy. Here's an important point that we came up with. In a lot of the literature around managed retreat, whether or not the relocation is voluntary is considered a really important hallmark of best practice. What we find here is that it's neither voluntary nor mandatory. Well, it is mandatory, but it was also voluntary. It's both. People wanted to move and were required to move. We didn't hear from a single person that they were moved against their will, and yet it was a mandatory move. So we suggest this is a nuanced question, whether or not it's voluntary. Clear cut as it is here in America. In other places, I think that coercion appears differently. And I really hope to do additional research. I proposed a project that would have me sampling from among hundreds of other villages around the country to get a better sense of whether this program is working across the country. Okay, I'm sorry if I took up extra time. I think the next talk I think is remote, yes? It's Julia. So what do I do here? Stop share, right? Okay. Thank you. Hi, Julia.
Hi, can you hear me? Should I share my screen now? I'm sorry, I can only see a very narrow part of the room, so it's Can you hear me?
Julia, I'm afraid we can't hear you. I think you have to change your audio source.
Can you hear me better now?
Julia, I'm afraid we're not able to hear you. So I think your audio isn't connected. I think you might have to change the audio source.
Then I don't know how to.
Wasn't her. That, yeah? Okay. Julia, try one more time, please.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
There we go. Sorry about that.
Sorry, I was over here going, I don't know. I tried everything. Okay, great. I hope you're still able to hear me now that I share my screen.
Would you be able to try sharing your screen again? I'm afraid we can't see that.
Okay, can you see it now?
Yes. Perfect. Okay.
Great. Okay, so you can see my screen. Everything is working so far. Just 1 second because I'm not on the presenter view. Sorry, this was working well before. Maybe I'm sharing the wrong thing. Okay. Do you see now? But you see the notes, right?
Julia, the first way you shared was actually great. Would you be able to do that one again, and you can open presenter notes from there?
Oh, okay, let me try this. So but now do you see my slides? I mean, my notes?
Yes. No, we don't see your notes.
You don't see the notes?
No.
Okay. Okay, great. So then sorry for the sorry for my confusion here. So thank you so much to the previous speaker. This was really interesting. My name is Julia Blocher. I'm a project lead at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, and I'm also with the Humboldt University in Berlin. I wanted to be with you in person, but unfortunately today I'm calling in from Berlin. So I'm going to present a relatively narrow piece of work that is a contribution from the Potsdam Institute to the Habitable project, which is a EU Horizon 2020 funded project looking at habitability concepts, and we're doing work in 5 primary case study countries, 4 of which are in Africa. So the work I'm presenting today is a bit of a background piece of work that we did to try to understand better what factors are involved in out migration. And we use this to inform the work that we did in the 5 primary case study countries of the Habitable project, which includes semi-structured interviews, a survey, and focus group discussions. So this is an ongoing project, and we hope that we'll be able to present results at the next conference. So this paper I'm presenting today is in submission, and it's looking at what are really the factors pushing people to decide that they need to leave a place over time. So this is how it's related to this managed retreat concept. And our hypothesis in this paper is that migration is a response strategy after shocks significantly erode household resources, particularly for those with limited coping capacities. And what we find that previous research quantifying the links between environmental shocks and migration tend to show weak or mixed results in terms of the strength and direction of environmental effects. So in order to advance understandings of the environment migration nexus and to better inform policies on these, we need to take a look at better understanding the context. And also we wanted to explore if there's a stronger relationship indicating what factors push people to migrate out over time. So we seek to refine the current analysis by introducing three main points: a larger variety of shocks, including both environmental and non-environmental types. We disaggregate households by fundamental characteristics, such as whether they are rural or urban, depending on agricultural livelihoods or not, poor or non-poor, etc. And finally, we use a more nuanced temporal embeddedness of shocks, considering shocks in the past, not just in one time step. So this follows previous work using panel data in East Africa, and we define shocks as adverse events that lead to a loss of household income, a reduction in consumption, and or a loss in productive assets. Coming to a bit more about our data and methods, we used 3 waves of the Tanzania National Panel Survey conducted between 2008 and 2013. And we restricted our sample to the original households that were present in the first wave, plus the split off households. And we constructed a few different migration variables, but the primary outcome variable we looked at in our models is whether any member from the household had been absent for 3 or more months in the 12 months prior to the survey enumeration. So it's an absentee variable, essentially. For our shock variables, we rely on a detailed module of the survey in which the household head is asked to consider a list of 18 disruptive events and then rank the top 3 in terms of the severity of loss of income, loss of assets, or loss of both. We adapt the classification approach developed by John Hodnott and others at the World Bank and divide the shocks into aggregate categories of environment and non-environmental shocks. We conducted a number of robustness tests to ensure that our categorization is not driving the results. And this is detailed in the paper. And in the paper, we also look at shocks individually, not just at these aggregate categories, but I won't have time, I think, to go into that today. We use a fixed effects panel model in this work in which the migration outcome variable is the outcome of the occurrence of shocks, S, in the current time period, T, which is 12 months prior to the survey enumeration, and previous time periods, 13 to 60 months before the survey enumeration. So in the paper, we also present additional results for extended models controlling for a range of socioeconomic background characteristics in order to capture the differential impacts of shocks on different population groups. So now I want to also quickly address the local context of livelihoods in Tanzania, which these pie graphs attempt to explain a little bit, particularly that there's a really significant difference between people in urban areas versus in rural areas. So the top 3 pies are descriptives for the rural respondents in our sample, and the bottom 3 are for the urban respondents. And I'll explain a bit more in a minute. So Tanzania just relatively recently graduated into lower middle income class, and it's a country in which over 60% of people are dependent on agriculture and have really limited liquidity or social safety nets or really any regular coping mechanisms. Regularly used coping mechanisms. Most people live in rural areas, and many of them are poor according to the wealth categories that we constructed with this data by looking at dwelling characteristics and assets. And our wealth categories were adapted from the Demographic and Health Survey's Wealth Index that's used by USAID. So the first set of pies in teal show that as compared to urban households, rural households are much less likely to have a migrant family member. The second set in blue shows that rural households are less likely to have non-agricultural primary income sources. And the third set in black shows that rural households are less likely to have indicators of wealth like improved flooring or sanitary facilities. Urban households are more likely to have all these things. Now coming to our model results, I wanted to focus today on the results for our aggregate shock measures as mentioned before. So this figure shows our the model results. We see marginal effects of environmental and non-environmental shocks on household mobility over time, meaning that the changes in migration probability with each additional shock experienced by the household in the time window considered. So we have marginal effects on the y-axis and the lagged environmental shocks on the x-axis. And these lags are for the period time t, which is the 12 months prior to the survey. T minus 1 is 24 months prior to survey, T minus 2, so on to T minus 4. So our panel A shows the marginal effects of lagged environmental shocks on the probability of a household member being absent in the period concerned, whereas panel B shows the marginal effects of the lagged non-environmental shocks. So what we can see is that there's a significant and meaningful effect for our aggregate measure for environmental shocks on mobility patterns. The probability of having an absent household member in the current time period T increases by 0.81% with each additional environmental shock experienced. We see also significant but weaker effects in the previous time periods, lags 24 to 36. And for the period 48 to 60 months prior to the survey, the effects remain positive, so still in the same direction, but the results become non-significant. On the other hand, we see for our aggregate non-environmental shock measure that the observed effects on mobility are inconsistent, which we can come back to a bit later, but our results overall really highlight the importance of the wider temporal context in this research, and also the potential interdependencies of the occurrence of shocks over time. So just to come to some key findings, including a few that I would be happy to discuss further in the discussion. Our key findings, we found that households face a large variety of shocks, and they're interdependent and co-occur over time. We found that there's a cumulative effect of environmental shocks on migration in the current time period, but the probability increases with each additional environmental shock experienced. We find that our aggregate shocks measure is positively related to migration probability over time, also when considering the broader context of the previous time periods. In extended analyses in the paper, we find that the types of diverse household shocks really matter to migration responses, which is in line with the existing literature. And we also find that household characteristics matter in migration probabilities. So overall, if we consider that migration probabilities may only become apparent or more apparent over time, there are a number of different ways why we can explain this. For example, that we could interpret that households require time and effort to produce, to prepare for a migration response, especially if it involves the mobility of a household member. Migration can be very expensive, and in Tanzania, we've seen it's a socially and financially expensive endeavor, and so many households may not readily have the resources available for a household member to travel or to migrate. Secondly, we could say that exposure to shocks may erode household resources in the immediate aftermath of the shock, which would delay household adaptation and coping responses and delay potentially the migration of household members. Our findings overall, we think, complement the existing body of literature by presenting a more consistent picture for environmental shocks in the aggregate, as well as for specific shocks and for certain types of households, and addressing the question of the inconsistent results from previous quantitative studies. It may be that there was insufficient consideration of temporal aspects and longitudinal aspects, insufficient consideration of different household types, and perhaps insufficient consideration of the difference between how environmental shocks versus non-environmental shocks would affect household response strategies, including migration. So thank you very much. I look forward to discussing further and be happy to be in touch via email, Twitter, and I want to say again, thanks to the European Commission for the help with funding this project.
So hi, my name is Fabien. I hope you can all see the screen. If not, just announce. Otherwise, I assume it's all good. I'm a postdoctoral at Columbia. Today, I'll be an associate research scientist at the beginning of July. Today, what I will be doing is presenting joint work with colleague Alex here present today, Richard Seeger, climate scientist at Lamont Dorothy Earth Observatory, and two research assistants, Elizabeth Nguyen and Elizabeth Leon. There's from the outset, I should say, this is still early work, so comments and feedback are much welcome because we're still initially working on this. So this paper is this project rather is titled "Weather Shock, Crop Price, and Migration in West Africa: Insight from High-Frequency, Large-Scale Surveys." It is a follow-up work as part of a project funded by the National Science Foundations, looking at driver of migration in West Africa, and it's following on a set of different papers where we've been looking at the nature and structure of network of migration in West Africa, as well as the effect of crop prices and climate shock on intra-regional migration in the continent using census data. Now, so in this paper, what we'll do is, as I mentioned, it's a follow-up. So we investigate how weather shocks and international price variability influence migration in West African countries. And is there an issue? Oh, okay, thank you. The reason for this investigation is previous investigation was kind of limited by the difficulty in obtaining high quality data on migration in the sub-Saharan African context and in West Africa in particular. And this matters a lot. Most of the cross-sectional time series analysis being relying on census data or data from immigration register in Western countries, but this later is limited in terms of like coverage. It's only migration flow to Europe, for instance, and the former is suffering from high variability in terms of quality. Some countries have good census in the region, some countries do not. The frequency of the census are also varied to the point that whenever one uses those census data, we have like a number of questions that really matters, that are really hanging there in terms of to what degree we can actually trust the census data, to what degree this give us good insight about on the migration structures of the in the region, and this obviously it's related to the fact that census in the region are deeply political because they matter in terms of distribution of political power. Another issue is that census data only provide us insight on permanent migrations, but empirical evidence that exists and have been out there for a long time, and this is famous study by Finlay in 1994 shows that the degree to which migration response to environmental shocks varies a lot whenever one looks at permanent migrations or seasonal circular migration. So for instance, she finds that the drought in Mali in the 80s actually decreased long distance migration flow permanent form of migration, while short-term seasonal form of migration actually increased during this period. But this, of course, we cannot look at those forms of migrations and difference in destination using census data. So to overcome these challenges, and this is still, as mentioned, like ongoing, we use novel geocoded data that on migration that is provided by the International Organization for Migration. These are the flow monitoring surveys. So what are those surveys? These are since 2019, the IOM has been implementing surveys across West Africa at 46 different flow monitoring points, which generally are transit stations, mostly throughout the Sahel. And every 4 months, they send a team there and they would randomly sample 400 migrants and ask them a bunch of questions regarding the demographic background, economic activity, where they come from, what is the intended destination, and stated reason for migration. So in total, it's a huge number of surveys. So it's about 220,000. So this is a non-trivial amount of information. And it's enabled us to study how migration response to climate change may vary on different timescales and specialities of migration. Before going further into the into the data. I just want to let us know a little bit of our theoretical background. So as you're all aware, there's a growing literature on climate change and migrations. And in general, the assumption is that, in particular in southern countries, the primary channel that relates climate shocks to migration is the agricultural channel, and especially in West Africa, where the share of the agricultural sector is relatively high, and therefore the idea is being that climate shocks have a detrimental effect on crop yields, and therefore might push people to migrate. Now, obviously, substantial question remains. This is evidenced by lack of empirical agreements. For instance, while we have been growing evidence that climate shock do increase rates of internal migration and intra-regional migrations across the world, in West Africa in particular, to what degree those climate shocks might be increasing migration to Europe is more debated. Some scholars here at Columbia have found evidence that higher temperature, for instance, increase the number of asylum requests in Europe. My own research with a colleague in Texas rather suggests that drought actually decreased the flow of irregular migration to Europe. So there's obviously like ongoing question regarding to what degree different destinations of migration respond to climate shocks. Obviously, the time scale I mentioned, seasonal versus permanent form of migration matters. And a lot of those studies implicitly assume those migrants are rather rural. Is that true? We don't actually know. We don't have the data. Those surveys can be useful here. Right now at this stage, we really focus on the first aspect, the question of destination, but we aim to expand this in the coming months. So a little bit more, there's also a nation literature that examines how variation in international prices for crops matter for migrations. This is relate both to literature in the economic history that links prices shocks for wheat and other form of crops to mass migration out of Italy into the US in the late 19th century. There's a similar research in India, for instance, also, but there's also a more recent research that's been looking at climate shocks in Indonesia, like price shocks in Indonesia and migration. In our own work with colleagues here at Columbia, we've been looking at how price shock affect intra-regional migration rates in West Africa. In general, the idea is that higher global crop price may be linked to higher income and employment for farmers, right? And whether this might translate to higher rates of migration depends a lot in the context. So where migration barriers are low, right? So it's relatively cheap to migrate in relative terms, of course. Higher global crop price would actually decrease out migration because it makes it more attractive to stay where you are. On the other hand, where migration barriers are high and it's really costly for people to migrate, for instance, migration to Europe, if you're in the US, if you're in West Africa, or migration internationally, if you're in Indonesia, where those migration barriers are high, then higher prices could actually incredibly increase out migration rates. And as I mentioned, so our own research has found that higher prices actually decrease out migration out origin in West Africa. This is under review currently. So that's a little bit about where we come from in theory in terms of the data. So I mentioned already these are large-scale surveys implemented since 2018, and every 4 months, the OM is sending a team to randomly sample 400 migrants in those flow monitoring points. These are 46 flow monitoring points, mostly located in the Sahel and mostly in transit locations, so for instance, bus stations or any other places, nodes of movement. What is really interesting about those surveys, anybody that actually transit through those points can be surveyed. So whether you self-identify as a migrant or not does not matter. People would randomly sample you. Whether you're actually a resident locally, you could be a sample if you happen to transit through those locations. Obviously, we want to filter a little bit and only focus on migration. So anybody that, in our case, anybody that does not aim to travel for more than 2 weeks is filtered out. We also filter out people that travel for family reunifications or other non-migrations reasons, right? One difficulty we face is that the place of origin actually name strings, so we don't get the coordinates. So we use, with the help of a research intern here, we used Google API to geolocate those name strings of origin settlement of migrants. We were able to geolocate about 180,000, if I'm right. We also, as an openness check, did the same with OpenStreetMap. Now there's a number of limitations, and I'll show you here. So here I'm showing a map of all intentional migrants originating from West Africa in those 220,000 surveys. So that's about 50,000 plus migrants over those 4 years. What you can see here on this map, the orange dots are the location of those flow monitoring points. So first obvious remark is all those flow monitoring locations actually located throughout the Sahel band, which means we do have a good coverage of the migration network throughout the Sahel. We have less good coverage of the migration network between, say, coastal countries in the region. Yeah, there was a question. There are some of them on international borders, some of them are like within migration node, transit node in the country. The IOM has purposely selected areas where they know migrants actually traveling along. One other limitation, and I think relates to your point a little bit, is that these reflect funder priorities, and funder priorities are European countries, and they really care only about migration to Europe. So that we have good coverage of migration flows to North Africa, to Europe. We have much more limited coverage of internal flows or flows within the region. Another issue is, even though we have 46 locations, they are not open at the same time. The rest reflect obviously access to funding, but also security concerns. So these are things to always consider in mind and keep in mind whenever one uses those data. A note, so here, as I mentioned, I show you all the intentional migrants in those surveys, reflecting a little bit the locations of those flow monitoring points. We have quite a large number of migrants originating from Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, and outside of Guinea, Senegal, and Nigeria, much less coverage of those number of migrants, right? This picture is reflected here. If we focus on those that we can identify as traveling within the region only, again, we have good coverage of those silent countries and maybe worse coverage of the southern countries. Now, when we look at long distance migration, so migration primarily to North Africa or Europe, here we see a different picture emerging. We see a lot of people actually originating from Nigeria, Guinea, and a little bit southern countries. Yeah. So that I think this is always something to keep in mind. Is those surveys give you a good insight about the system of migrations, especially that flows toward northern countries. In terms of indicators for weather shock, we use the greenness indicator and the enhanced vegetation index, which we measure over the maize growing area. And we interact that with a dummy for the rainy season, so April, May, June, and July, because we really want to focus on this period specifically. The price data come from US prices. We built composite indicators of price variability for a basket of crops for 11 crops that are grown in West Africa, mostly staple crops. There's 2 cash crops there, it's cotton and groundnuts, but most of them are wheat, sorghum, rice, and a number of others. We use Bartik weights, so that gives us an exogenous indicators of those price variability by weighting this basket of crops based on production amount in the pre-period. Right, so a little bit about the Ampega specification. So we have 17 countries in our sample at 4 years interval, at monthly intervals. The dependent variable is the log number of migrants. We also use quasi-Poisson as a robustness check. In the independent variable I already mentioned, one thing I want to add is that we add 3 variables, actually 2 dummies for the number of flow monitoring points within our administrative unit to account for the fact if there's an administrative flow monitoring point within this administrative unit, then you're more likely to see migrants in the first place, of course. And we also added dummy for the number of flow monitoring points, for the presence of flow monitoring points within 200 kilometers of an administrative unit. The unit of analysis is the second administrative unit level month. So we have a sample of about 70,000 admin month observations. And yeah, we use fixed effect, as I mentioned. What do we find? In general, we find, I show you here the effect of a reduction, one standard deviation reduction in the EVI, which what it is actually a drought. And what we find is that a drought during the rainy season actually increase out migration, but with a delayed effect. So about 8 to 9 months after the shock. And on the other hand, that's a bit of a puzzle. We find that a drought during the rest of the year actually decrease out migrations consistently, and we're not exactly sure what it is, but it could be related to the fact that if there's a drought outside of the rainy season, there's more work that is required in the fields. These findings are mostly driven by long distance migration, actually, to North Africa or Europe, less so for Western Africa. And when it comes to prices, we find a higher price actually increase out migration, but here also it's driven by long distance migration. I will leave it there because I think I'm running out of time. But just to say, this is initial results. We aim now to distinguish between seasonal and permanent migration, use OpenStreetMap geocoding, which we have now as a robustness check, and also look at internal migration data, but this is a bit more complex because of the fact that you are more likely to see internal migration that occurs in close proximity to those flow monitoring points. And yeah, that's it. Thank you so much.
So do I share?
Yeah.
Is it unmuted? No.
You know how to do that?
Do you know how to hide them?
You're to the far right, and exploding.
Hi, Florida. All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Susan Eko. I work for the German Institute of Development and Sustainability as a researcher. So today I'll be sharing with you about one of the projects that I'm involved in that I've been working on for the past few months. Going to move to the next slide. Okay, just click. All right, so this project is funded by the BMZ, so it's the German Agency for Development Cooperation. And the whole idea for the project really is to understand how local agreements on migration policy at the global level are localized at the national level, but also subnational level. But also importantly is to understand how migration policies intersect with global megatrends such as climate change, urbanization, and state fragility. So within this frame, I'm really interested in understanding how migration policy and climate change and then urbanization intersect. And so for this research, the questions that I'm interested in exploring is how these global agreements are localized towards addressing climate change and human mobility, and specifically to try to understand what the gaps are. Okay. Sorry about that. So also to understand what the gaps are, what the challenges are, and what the opportunities are. And then at the city level. And so the two case studies that are studied for this particular research project is Accra in Ghana and Dakar in Senegal. And so the reason for the choice of these two cities is for various reasons. These two cities are coastal cities in West Africa. Their histories of rural to urban migration. In Ghana, for example, there's been a long-standing history of people migrating from the northern region towards the southern region, including cities like Accra. And this mobility is because within these areas or people moving, those are primarily agricultural-based economies. And many of these people, the agricultural productivity has been affected. So in the past, people would move, but cyclical. So they will move during off seasons and go back. But the patterns that are being observed now is that people are staying longer within these cities. Similarly, in Dakar, people are also moving from rural areas. Part of the drivers are climate related. And so we have those dynamics of mobility. At the same time, like Fabien already mentioned, there are these patterns of movement towards Europe. In Senegal, for example, there's mobility across the Mediterranean towards European countries. So some of those are the migration concerns within the region. At the same time, these cities are also vulnerable to climate change. Being coastal cities, there are risks of sea level rise, but also coastal flooding and exposure for coastal communities. Heat stress is another vulnerability that these cities experience. And so climate mobility really is a topic that should be of interest within the city's leadership. And so I tried to explore that through this research. Another thing that's important to mention is that there are mayors in quotes within these two cities. So for Accra, the mayor is appointed, but for Dakar, Senegal, there's an election where the mayor is elected into office. And this is important because I'm trying to understand the governance of climate mobility. And so to some definitions and theoretical framework, I'm really interested in understanding the political dimensions of, addressing climate-induced mobility. So in terms of governance, really, we're interested here in processes and control in terms of authority. So who's responsible for addressing these issues? And then to understand how, ideas, power, power here is conceptualized not only in power that's visible, but also there's hidden power. People embody different powerful structures that enable certain priorities to be implemented over others. And so the framework that I'm using for this research is actors, objectives, and context. Here is to understand that actors can be societal, they can also be political. So we're not only talking about people who are working in government agencies, but other types of actors like civil society, NGOs, and so on and so forth. And each actor comes in with their objectives. They have their priorities. They have specific areas that they want to focus on or not focus on. And then there's an overall context. So we have like the environmental related context. We also have the political context. In West Africa, for example, there's the ECOWAS protocol that allows for free movement of people within the region. So these are some of the things that influence certain policy areas that are being implemented. And so in terms of methodology, this was quite like a small scale study. I focused primarily on document analysis. So looking through policy documents at the city level, and then conducting interviews with experts working either on climate change or experts working on migration. And these included civil society, representatives, international organizations, municipal departments, and regional departments that are working either on climate change or on migration. And so in terms of results, I'll just start by breaking it down. So we have international agreements. On one hand, we have the Global Compact for Migration, also on refugees. We also have the Paris Agreement. In several ways, these are global frameworks that countries sign on to, and then they decide to follow through or not. So on the side of Global Compact for Migration, as you may already know, like climate change was highlighted there as a driver. And then there are follow-up processes from this Global Compact for Migration that really try to touch on the intersection of climate change and human mobility. On the Paris Agreement side, we have the National Adaptation Plans, NAPs, and we also have the nationally determined contributions. These are some ways in which countries basically state what they're going to do on climate change. And then human mobility has been included by several countries. So there's this interesting study by folks from SLICAN Trust and UNUEHS that basically try to map out different countries that have highlighted human mobility or not. And so these are prescriptions that countries then sign on to, but the implementation is another ballgame entirely. At the same time, following through these processes, countries have their own national policies. They also have like policies on migration, on climate change. So to mention, Senegal and Ghana have both signed on to these global agreements. Ghana has a very interesting national migration policy, and theirs is also being operationalized. But on the other side, Senegal, they do have a migration policy, but it's not really in effect, like nobody actually uses it. But to mention, in Senegal, based on all of these global processes and agreements, Senegal has mandated that in all localized action plans or policies, that migration, climate change are one of the key priority areas that must be included in plans. And so they have, in a way, shaped the fact that these are key areas for, for the government. On the Ghana side, Ghana has a climate change adaptation policy, which very much specifically highlights climate change and human mobility. There, they even specify ways in which they will address this intersection. So ensuring that migrants are integrated within the country, but also within cities. So they also recognize that migrants tend to move towards cities. And again, the biggest issue is not the recognition of the intersection of climate change and mobility, but it's in the implementation. And so I'll just share some comments that I got from the interviews. On one side here is just establishing the fact that these global agreements act as a framework for governments to basically choose what to follow through with or not. So they decide to be in line with both the Global Compact and the SDGs, which is a separate process. This other one talks about what's happening in Ghana in terms of the climate change adaptation strategy and also the national climate change policy. And so it's interesting to look at, okay, apart from the global level and the national level, what happens at the subnational level? So to do this, I took a look at the urban climate action plans and resilience plans for both cities of Accra and Dakar. Again, the city levels, they are in alignment with whatever the national government is doing, and that acts as a framework for what they try to implement locally. But interestingly, in all of these plans, human mobility is not really a priority. Even though there's an understanding of these patterns of human mobility. It's recognized, so displacement is recognized, but there are no actionable steps towards addressing issues that pertain to human mobility, except for coastal restoration. So that's one of the strategies that was reflected in some ways. One thing that I think it's important to highlight is that for Dakar, as you can see, their climate action plan basically is an energy focused plan. And the priorities are shaped by the different interests of actors. So within that plan, many of these policies are funded by external donors. So they're funded by EU member states. They are funded by in partnership with different networks. And so that really shapes the priorities of these plans. So for example, for Dhaka, it was supported by COMSA. COMSA is a covenant of mayors that's basically a follow-up of the EU Green Deal. So again, their priority initially was on, supporting mitigation for countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And that's reflected in the priority areas that are highlighted in these different plans. The Accra plan, on the other hand, really highlights waste management. So that's like a key strategy for the government of Accra. And so this is important in understanding, okay, why is human mobility reflected and why is it not reflected? Let me try to hide this. Okay, so I was interested in seeing, okay, why is human mobility not prioritized in these plans? Because again, if it's not in the plans, then the implementation, there will be a gap in implementation. So this is one of the excerpts from interviews that I conducted, which is trying to explain why human mobility was not prioritized. So here is saying that sometimes there are conflicting interests. The donors have their interest on one hand, and then the city actors have their own interest on the other hand. So here in Senegal, in Dakar, the focus of the engagement on the development of this plan was on capacity building, was on planning, but the expectations of the municipality, they were really interested in implementation. They were interested in action on flood control measures, on bioclimatic buildings. One thing I need to mention is that city actors are not powerless. So when they come in engagement with these different actors who have the money, they're able to negotiate. So they're able to say, okay, you're interested in this, we're interested in this. How can we bring this together? And how can we figure out ways in which to implement areas that we're also interested in? For example, they were really interested in bioclimatic buildings. Also, importantly, is that in this case, the city was looking forward to low-hanging fruits. So they come in and help them to set up these policies, but in the implementation, they are thinking of what can we afford, what can we pay for? And so they say it's easy to pay for emission reduction strategies like buildings, retrofitting buildings, and all of these things are, easily able to be achieved rather than like large-scale adaptation projects that require a lot of funding. And then here is just talking about how also migration was never really a priority. They were interested in coastal erosion and flooding, which have mobility, they have mobility implications, but it's not really framed in that way. And so they're also interested in energy efficiency issues. Some of the reasons why human mobility is not prioritized is knowledge gaps. So once you talk to these different actors, they understand the patterns of human mobility. But when it comes to addressing the issue at the city level, that's where it becomes fuzzy, because they don't really understand, okay, how do we address this issue or not? And that's why it's not prioritized. Responsibility. City authorities don't feel like they have responsibility on migration. And this is because of the framing on migration. Most of the way migration is framed is that it's people moving towards Europe, people crossing the borders, and then the internal migration dynamics are not really prioritized. And so that creates a gap. There's limited vertical coordination. So at the national level, there's this interest in the climate change and human mobility nexus, but in terms of translating it towards the subnational level, that's where it gets fuzzy. They're not able to really do that effectively. There are limited capacity and resources. Cities don't have the manpower, they don't have the funding to be able to address these intersections. But however, there have been some progress in terms of addressing climate change and immobility. Just to mention that in many cases, this is, once there's an issue, there's a response. So there's a reactive response towards human mobility and climate change issues. So for example, if they observe that there are a lot of beggars within the city who have sometimes migrated and climate change drivers may be an issue, they try to respond by providing services to people who are vulnerable. They mitigate displacement through coastal restoration where there's funding. But one thing I really want to highlight is the Global Cities Fund for Migrants and Refugees. That has been really instrumental for cities like Accra to be able to address this intersection of climate change and human mobility. Like I mentioned before, waste is a priority of Accra, but they conducted a study and they found out that a lot of migrants are involved in this informal waste sector. So through this funding arrangement, they are able to provide services for these migrants involved in the informal waste sector. So addressing resiliency within the city through this funding arrangement. There are also several other civil society organizations that play critical roles in supporting migrants within the city. Just to mention that the strategy of addressing climate mobility really is to understand first that climate change is a driver and then provide migrant support and refugee support to migrants who are already within the city. The second thing is to understand that migrants typically sometimes will reside in vulnerable locations. So once there are like strategies to building resilience in these vulnerable locations, migrants benefit from those actions. Just to conclude and say that direct funding streams to subnational governments is a way to address some of the gaps that have been observed here. There's a need to strengthen emphasis on human mobility in these local climate action plans. For example, Accra is thinking of revising their plan and they're going to more strongly emphasize human mobility. Capacity building and knowledge exchange is important. These networks are useful in terms of like highlighting some of these issues, but it's also important to emphasize locally led adaptation, according to that paper there. I think sometimes the projects are top down in a way. So you have the funders on one hand, you have the mayors on one hand, but it's important to understand like from the ground up, what are the issues, how to design these projects and how to focus funding areas on these specific issues. So thank you, I'll just close there. If there are any questions, I can answer them, thanks.
So I think we only have about 10 minutes left, although I will say that at when the session ends at 10, we may be able to stick around longer. There's not another session immediately after. There's a few minutes for the buffer. So we're happy to take questions now. I don't know, Hannah, do you have a, yes, go ahead, please. Yeah, that's what she's getting at, I think.
I know you're addressing the challenges of migration and that you're based on word. How compared to going to use that?
Yeah, that's a good question. We're planning to do so. We haven't yet have the time to use the data, but that's part of the plan. Definitely, we can actually, we know if someone's says they plans to returns, whether someone says, well, I want to move permanently, or which we will use also as a proxy for permanent move, but I don't have any plans to return. So, but yeah, we don't have any yet the time to look at this.
This is a question for Julia. This is Alex DeSherman. Hi, Julia. I just was, first of all, just wanted to say, I think it's a really fascinating question you're asking. Justin Rebeau in Senegal has also spoken about the kind of underlying precarity in the ocean. I saw the image of the egg on the edge of the cliff, and what he described as, is climate really the factor for when people are already sitting at the edge of the cliff, and it's just disaster. I did wonder about the effect size. So you have a significant effect, but it's like less than 1%. And it didn't seem to me like that was particularly strong. So I didn't find something. Well, you can go with the questions until she comes on. Any way to get her screen? Maybe we should go ahead with other questions while we're waiting.
Great.
Hi, I had a question about the Blocher case. Could you just elaborate on what it would mean for the municipalities to take mobility more seriously? And how does that relate to mobility issues in terms of commuting?
Yeah, I think it's important that they take it seriously because honestly, they recognize the patterns. They recognize that, you know, the city is becoming more urbanized and climate change is one of the drivers. There are resulting effects of that. So the growth in informal settlements is one of them, and the ripple effects that that has within the city, and also understanding the pressures on infrastructure and all of these things that are already challenged. And so being able to have access to like additional funding support to address climate mobility really helps them in their overall urban resilience approaches or strategies, and also to basically move beyond thinking about mobility as, you know, moving outside of the country towards like European countries. Is also important to address like these internal mobility dynamics that cities tend to face the pressures from. So I think that there's certainly benefits in addressing mobility within the city, and especially within Dhaka. Also to mention, because of this like growth, like serious growth within the city, they've actually started building another city, a new city, close to Dhaka, just to be able to like decongest. So they have another city that they're building, Diaminado, but the problem with that is that it's catered towards, you know, high income, and it's going to be really expensive to live there. There are a lot of businesses that will be moving there. So it's not like clear how that's going to benefit like a lot of the vulnerable groups within the city. And also the approach to preventing displacement in terms of addressing like the vulnerabilities of coastal residents is also critical.
Question for Lisa from the first presentation. And apologies to pick up on this because I'm clouded by jet lag. But you, the final slide, you said there are positives and negatives. My impression was that the situation is now less resilient or fragile. And lots of cows are one shed of emerging disease through there. And I don't know about this area and other areas of disease. So the first question is, between that fair assessment? And the other side was, you said that there was a positive reaction. People went into the relocation willingly. But you also said they had no experience of livestock, and the land they were given in the relocation wasn't particularly good. Was there a sense that persuaded on false pretenses, or am I reading between the lines?
Great, thanks. Good questions. I think that the results are mixed, right? They were transformed both positively and negatively. The biggest challenge was difficulty growing crops, which seems sort of foundational, right? And if people are suddenly hungry for the first time, it's hard to think this was a positive move. One of my main takeaways is that I think the main benefits from this resettlement policy is generational. I think the kids that are now going to school, that are learning off-farm job skills, that are gaining access to sort of the modern world in ways that their parents never had, I keep thinking, boy, I'm going to come back in 20 years and then assess it, and that may be, in fact, what the government has in mind, that these are shorter term hiccups, and that maybe irrigation, for example, could be provided that would help with crop growing or something like that, and that in fact the investments that the government is making in the next generation will be felt down the road. So that's a neither here nor there answer. Your second question was, yes, I think yes, that it is true that they were promised, rainbows and unicorns, and but they had been advocating to move for years and years. Everybody told us at every meeting we asked for this. We've wanted to move, and finally we were heard. Now, they have very limited information and limited ability to really imagine what this might be like, what they're signing up for. And certainly the government has every reason to paint a very sunny picture of this. And then they got there and found that it was harder than they expected, and maybe things weren't quite as fair. And again, I keep reverting to, well, maybe this also is generational, that the disruption to livelihoods is felt more keenly by the older generation than by the younger. And maybe some of those will have ironed out down the road. But yes, I think people very willingly and quite enthusiastically accepted the mandatory move. And when they arrived, some have been quite pleased and some have really struggled, maybe as expected. Thanks for asking.
I have a question from the Q&A on Zoom. Kevin asked, regarding Rwanda, it sounds like there were considerations other than the climate risk in choosing the islands to reset. You mentioned military uses for one of the islands, for example. Given the climactic problems in the new location you mentioned, how much of this policy is motivated by climate adaptation, and how much of it is some other policy that's sold?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the climate adaptation piece has been sort of tacked onto it, right? And that's why I sort of forced you through this history of resettlement policy in Rwanda to see how deep that goes and the desire to relocate people. However, it is also true that Rwanda is seeing an increase in natural disasters and an increase in expenses related to those disasters. And so the money and time that they are spending to sort of rescue and rehabilitate lands that are distant reinforces their policy to consolidate into these model villages. So I think it's legitimate that the government has become attentive to climate adaptation. It's also true, of course, that there are layers of other motivations and goals, and certainly having households living on this island in a strategic and dangerous, unsafe location for the government was completely unacceptable. And pick from the drop-down menu the reasons why. One of them is maybe the government wants to use that property for military use, but also it fits right into this long-standing resettlement policy. Also, it's high risk and climatic conditions are shifting. So I think it's at this point in my research, I can't meaningfully identify one over the other, but I think it's a good question because I think those are all in play.
And just to let you know, this is the final question as we are at 10.
Okay.
Yeah, this is a short follow-up question for you, just describe. So then, how was this new location chosen? If it's by drought, as a geographer, to me that makes sense.
Yeah, I think so. Rwanda is the most densely populated country in Africa. It's incredibly small, and every meter is accounted for. So I don't think they have a ton of options to shop around for sort of better sites. And remember the example I gave, the Rweru model village, is one of hundreds of model villages all over the country. Some of them are in really ideal sites, some of them are in quite subpar sites. And the government is really interested in consolidating in all parts of the country. The eastern province where my research took place is regionally as it's a quarter of the country and it's prone to drought everywhere. So sort of what do you do about that, right? So a lot of these sites are always going to have these inherent problems and challenges. And so it's not a great answer, but I think I think they're quite limited in their options in what lands they're able to build on. Thanks for asking. Thanks to everybody for your great talks. So